This is Get in the Mecha, the weekly anime and manga show where we take things one step further. I analyze everything from arcs to OPs to episodes in my wacky but enjoyable quest to make sense of all of it. Welcome back to Get in the Mecha. I'm your host Jamal today, and in today's episode we are doing something a bit different, or at least we have a very normal show today, and then we are going to try something different today. So in today's episode, as you can tell from the title, we are looking at the sakuga, or at least the animation behind Jujutsu Kaisen. Today's episode, similarly to what I did with, say, Fire Force, if you listen to that, or even the character acting episode, what I'm going to be doing is basically just going through a few animators that you probably ought to know on a work like Jujutsu Kaisen. Sadly, as always, I won't be able to cover every animator, but it's an attempt to at least bring you some of the names that you probably would be best knowing going forward with the production. And then we will actually be going on to a new segment that will be a voice submission segment, or the voice sub segment. So we have 3 voice subs, and we'll be just discussing a few things basically. So I don't want to give too much away, as I usually say, but anyway, let's get into the episode for this week. That is episode 71 of Get in the Mecha, taking a close look at the animation of Jujutsu Kaisen. As always on the show, I like to provide you my alerts as to whether there are spoilers inbound, and there will be light to no spoilers for this. The most I will be spoiling really are the fights which will occur or have occurred across the first 7 episodes, and I'm not even going to be talking about every single one of them because that's not what we're analyzing. So it's not going to be very specific and talking about the plot and context behind them, but really just talking about them as is. It's not even all fighting animation that we're going to be discussing today, but just do be aware that if you are very conscious about spoilers, then this might unfortunately upset you. But on the most part, I'm going to be talking about animator styles and the animators themselves and how they fit into the work, rather than just this is what's happening in Jujutsu Kaisen, because I'm not even completely sure myself. Okay, I'm joking about that. I know what's going on in the anime, but I'm very focused on animation for this episode, so do not fear if you haven't watched Jujutsu Kaisen or you are very early into it, because it's not a spoiler fest basically. JJK, or Jujutsu Kaisen, has been a very big surprise for me in regards to the level of quality so far, especially considering Park, who's wrapped up on The God of High School. Just to specify, Sunghoo Park being the director for the series. We'll also talk a bit about him as well, because he does play an animation role within this too, but Sunghoo Park wrapping up on The God of High School, I was expecting a potential decline in momentum, as you would think. That it's often, or that's what I think it'd be very logical or reasonable to suggest that there would be a bit of a decline in Jujutsu Kaisen's quality, potentially because of the momentum and directing 2 series that are airing back to back. But obviously that hasn't been the case, and sure, there are some very structural reasons for that, but I would also say it's just because Sunghoo Park is very involved and he gets very into his works, and that's something I really want to discuss, and how he's managed to really have an impact on this production. I think it really has been good to gain that experience working with Park, and they kind of know what to expect and know where Park is going to jump in and stuff. And so having that connection, I think, is a very important thing right off the bat anyway, going into the second anime directed by Sunghoo Park this year. I will be doing this in a similar format to my Fire Force animation analysis as well, where I will be putting this into different categories, but this time it's not going to be like how I did before in terms of like bread and butter, high impact, or whatever. But this time it's going to be on recognizable and less recognizable. This isn't a measure of animator popularity and fame. It's not to do with that. What it is to do with is really names that should be more familiar from The God of High School and moving forward borrowed from that, and that is in direct contrast to those to which who weren't particularly on the God of High School, you won't recognize from the previous Park works, but are now on JJK, and I'm not really going to be making much contrast between them, but I just think it's something important to note going forward. And so without wasting time, let us jump into the quote-unquote familiar animators. The first one is Sunghoo Park, and it's funny because I literally just said animators, but that is the very point, is the fact that he is animating as well as directing, which I think is really cool. I think Sunghoo Park, well, the biggest thing you should acknowledge about Sunghoo Park is that he's really passionate about getting stuck in and using these tools, and also just doing a lot by himself as well. That isn't to say that he doesn't have a great team around him or a great set of key animators around him for the sake of action and other things, but I would say that Sunghoo Park, for a director, is very involved. Most of the time when it comes to directing, whether that's series director, whether that's an episode director, most of the time you expect them to just direct, and I feel like most of us find that okay and enough. You're doing what you need to do, you're directing. Sometimes we do have storyboarding as well, and I do have a few examples of directors actually animating on their own works. This isn't something that hasn't been seen before, but based on how much Park did in the God of High School, it just seems simply insane. A few examples that I just picked out for the purpose of this podcast would be Hayao Miyazaki, who actually animated a few cuts on Princess Mononoke, Satoshi Kon, the legendary and unfortunately late filmmaker, who animated almost a minute worth, or I think it was around 40 seconds, on his own film, The Millennium Actress, and then even Masaaki Yuasa, who did a very small cut on Ping Pong the animation. I think it's towards the end, if not it's the final episode, when Smile just throws his table tennis bat, and all three of them can animate, and it's not a very distant concept for directors to also animate. As I've said in previous episodes as well, we do have staff who have experienced almost every other angle of production, and that's where a lot of the, say, bigger filmmakers got a lot of their experience. But Sunghoo Park really is pushing this to another level even as a director, and he's animating entire fight sequences for a whole episode, and it just really blows me away that he really seems to have a lot of drive and passion for it, just as he did in the God of High School. And I did predict that he probably won't be as involved, and I still stand by that, but I'm kind of retracting that now based on just how much he's really willing to just go head in or take this head on by himself. We can only sort of assume that it is Park who's animating. However, the Park style, as I'll make clear, it's rather obvious, if that makes sense, obviously from someone who hasn't looked at it, which I will be breaking down, so don't fear, but it's not very easy to tell like that. But once you've seen Sunghoo Park in action, and it only really takes one watch of the God of High School and a bit of referencing to realize that he's one of the more recognizable animators. From what I understand of it, Park animated quite a lot of the combat stuff in episode 7, which sees the fight between Gojo and Jogo. I don't understand the naming convention. I'm still kind of getting to grips with the naming conventions in Jujutsu Kaisen, and how we have like the two forms of Yuji, so we have Yuji and Sukuna, but even so, it's just funny to see Jogo versus Gojo and the reverse of the names. But that's besides the point. The main point is that how does Park manage to make these cuts work in episode 7? I would say for the combat stuff, which Park does quite a lot of already prior to either the God of High School or Jujutsu Kaisen, his fights are made very obvious and apparent through a few things, and these I would say are distance, line thickness, and diagonals. These all sound like very disconnected concepts, but I'll kind of merge them together. The thickness of Park's lines, or at least the smears which come from them when closest to the camera, this is when we really see the aggression and the force which comes from action moments in a scene like Jogo versus Gojo. This then links to distance because based on camera movement, and this occurs a lot in part cuts, I don't exactly know why, because it's not particularly him directing everything which he does these in, but I think it's probably through a bit of discussion in behind the scenes, but that isn't confirmed. I don't know that as a default fact. But even so, it's when the camera comes closest to the subjects in action, the line thickness increases, and this is a really great way of just showing how much attention is going into what is moving and what isn't. When the camera is moving, Park is simultaneously attempting to sort of assimilate himself with it and get that maximum effect in when the camera is at its closest. So we kind of touched on line thickness and distance. The distance and line thickness increase as they go up. As the camera increasingly gets closer to its subject, the thickness really comes out. And a great example of this on another show, which also has Sunghoo Park, is Pokemon Generations. I can't tell you what episode it is, but I watched it very recently because I just finished the series. And yes, that is a very big moment for him, I would say, as me understanding him as director, and we really see it on the Pokemon which he works with, and he applies it to things that aren't even human, which is a really cool thing. And then finally, I did say diagonals is a very big feature of Park, and yes, he mostly applies these diagonal sort of looks to the models. It's not really going off model, but it's really how he manages to animate and draw some of the limbs and their sort of attack starts. So with a lot of the punches in Gojo versus Jogo, you can see there's these sort of sharp curves which are the way of drawing the limbs, and so, or the joints, I think is a better term. So when Gojo is about to kick Jogo, you can see there's this, it's not a curvature, it's curved, but it's also sharp. And as a result, I think that just appears a lot more antagonistic and a lot more brutal, as opposed to if that was something that was smoothed off. Reminds me a lot of what animator Yo Yoshinari often does in some of his works, where it's very curve, sharp, vertice, curve, sharp, vertice. It feels a lot more bumpy and a lot more exciting, as opposed to if it was nice and smoothed off, as some animators would do, which isn't a problem, but we have to remember that each drawing and frame is meant to really communicate what the animator wants to communicate. And if we forget that, I think we also lose a lot of the emotion in animation. And so Park really manages to do that in his style and within his combat work. We see it a lot also, and sorry, I was literally about to end that point, but for an animator like Park, who focuses a lot on shape is a very big part of how Park communicates emotions, and in this case force, and the impact of force in Jogo's fabric as it flaps in this very diagonal fashion, as we have these, if you were to sort of break it down, these triangular shapes which make up how the fabric curves as Jogo's getting completely destroyed and smashed through the forest, and all of that, is he's just tumbling all over the place as a result of Gojo's like sheer power. Because of how Park animates, I think we're able to get a better understanding of impact, as instead of simply just the attack itself, and that is really done well through the fabric. And now we move on to our next animator, and this is an animator which is gaining a lot of popularity, particularly in the recent years, and this is Keiichiro Watanabe. Keiichiro is probably a favorite in the soccer community at the moment. Maybe I might be generalizing a bit, but Watanabe is I want to say a kind of master at one-to-one combat, and they prove that exactly during the Gojo versus Sukuna fight within episode 2 of the show. Also, just for a bit of reference for those that want to maybe see some of his cuts in a bit more detail, or at least look out for them in The God of High School, I recommend episode 7, where he has this really crazy morphing cut where this sort of spirit generates behind the guy with the scythe. And I'm only saying guy with the scythe because The God of High School just went completely over my head. I watched it, I finished it, it was okay, but I can't tell you most of the characters' names or anything. And so I can only really remember by animated scenes. So Keishiro's morphing scene in episode 7, and then episode 2, probably one of the best fights I think this year that I've watched is the very brutal one. That's set in episode 2, the main fight basically. Those are two Keiichiro cuts which I really recommend because it shows us how Keiichiro smears and the importance of which he sort of keeps. It really shows how Keiichiro smears, and it really shows the importance which they hold smearing as an animation technique. Smearing, as I've just said, is a very important part of, or probably the most important part of understanding a Keiichiro Watanabe cut. And it's a massive part of fighting animation in general. It mirrors how we perceive things traveling at fast speeds, and it's just a very good part of communicating emotion through frames alone. One or two smear frames can make all the difference between how we understand a character as. We can understand them as forceful with a lot of smearing. We can understand them as very wacky and erratic because of how we smear. If we're to stretch a character in some of the smear frames, we can see them as flexible and a lot of things. A smear doesn't have one purpose when it comes to what it's trying to do, but the animator, as Keiichiro Watanabe proves, the animator takes control of that perception, and when they generate the right perception or a very good perception, I think it works even better for getting a great emotional insight into the very scene of which they're animating. I'm aware that I probably do have a lot of people that aren't maybe fully in touch with the language, and so I know I do it in other episodes, but it is probably not a good idea to assume that you know, and so I want to really take the time to at least explain that. And so by smear, I mean the extension of a movement. I think that's probably the best way I've tackled explaining it recently. It's not the most accurate explanation, but it serves a good function. As I said, it's just a good way of emulating the human experience which comes with seeing. But on to Watanabe, how does he use smears? And this is very apparent in his one cut or one set of cuts within the show so far. This is recorded when we have episodes 1 to 7 only. But he breaks a lot of rules when it comes to smearing, and great example again from the God of High School and his appearance, and that would be episode 2 when he essentially detaches the legs from the actual feet. So the character running is basically running in quote-unquote air. We're able to basically exploit how we understand movement, really. But as a result of that very phenomenon, if we can call it that, Watanabe takes advantage of this. And a really great example is how Watanabe abuses smears within this fight. There's literally a whole frame where Sukuna's hand is going right through Gojo's chest, and it isn't because of the logic of the show, it's because of how we see it and how we perceive it. As they spin, because we have a 3D background in place as well, as we spin, this only adds to the very rotational factor as we see arms spinning about, within the chaos. I think it is appropriate to also credit some of the other people who worked on this episode as well, and the biggest one would probably be Ryohei Takeshita, who did the storyboarding and was episode director for episode 2, and it's important to kind of lay out that it isn't simply the animator, and the animator is majorly important, and I'll kind of go into a bit more depth about Watanabe. Episode direction and storyboarding is so important to make some of these things happen, and so the groundwork to allow Keiichiro to abuse these ideas of motion, or at least sight, and how we view motion in sight, the fact that was in play, I think is a very good thing. And so Takeshita, Park, and a lot of other people behind the scenes, I'm sure, really helped make this thing happen. Really, it all managed to really come together in that short 3-second moment of the spinning and Gojo coming beneath Sukuna's arm and all of that. It's a very thought out cut. Nothing like this really comes easy and just comes out of pure genius, I would say. The spin basically has this it's an illusion basically. Animation is an illusion, but specifically this part we have a almost double spin illusion, which I kind of thought about when I was re-looking at this cut, and it's really because of what I mentioned before, being how this fight is sequenced, because of Gojo's powers or whatever they are. I don't want to jump ahead in the logic of the show, but because of that, and how Gojo manages to appear out of nowhere, we do still get this double spin illusion, which I mentioned, and I just wanted to use that to prove the point that it is a combination of things that come into this. This is smart choreography and sequencing that allows this to happen. Is also a really good animator that knows how to really exemplify this thing through their smears and their rule-breaking smears, or at least convention-breaking smears. And yeah, I think it's a combination of those things together that makes this scene work. In summary, Watanabe is a great animator. I recommend checking out some of his other stuff as well. He did a cut on Dororo. He did a bunch of stuff on The God of High School. He's done some stuff on Mob Psycho 100. I recommend all of it because he's a really good insight into animation today. And I am really confident that they can really push things further with the animation space in general. Then we move on to our quote-unquote less familiar, and I have two animators and a sort of group of animators. You can probably tell if you know your way around the production, you probably know who I'm talking about already, but I won't spend too much time on them. But in this case, we have Kouki Fujimoto. Fujimoto is a name that I think has been gaining a bit more attention recently, or maybe even a lot more, because of their role in My Hero Academia. They did quite a lot in season 4 actually, particularly on the gentle criminal fight, as well as some of the moments in the Shihasaki arc. But besides My Hero season 4, we have JJK, and we have Fujimoto's beautiful sequence, probably my favorite sequence in the show so far, and that is the running scene from Megumi as he runs up the stairs to only see the monster and the girl getting mauled by the monster, and then Yuji breaking through the window to then attack the monster. So it's a pretty intense moment and there's a lot going on, but I think Fujimoto handles it really, really well. From what I get from the Fujimoto cuts within JJK, they really value line thickness and line weight. I'll be honest, as someone who isn't an artist or an animator, I don't really know the complete difference between those, but just know that I will probably be using those interchangeably, but I'll kind of leave it to thickness as that makes a bit more sense to me. I think it's quite easy to forget when we talk a lot about smearing that it's one thing, or at least we can assume that sometimes it's one unified thing, that this is what smearing is, but it's easy to forget when we define it like that there are so many different ways of smearing, and that smearing is very adaptable and very based around what you're doing. And so Fujimoto and, as I said before, Watanabe they're two very amazing animators in the sense that they're able to adapt it based on their circumstances and what they're trying to do and what they're trying to tell. Again, in my favorite scene within Jujutsu Kaisen so far, I really loved how Fujimoto is very intentional with how he smears. So these hand signs which Megumi does are very thickly smeared, if that makes sense, or it uses and utilizes very thick smears to portray it, whereas we have much less outlined smears and much more calm smears for more general motions, like just moving your hands through the air when running, or at least when they're swishing through the air, they're much calmer smears. So I don't know how intentional this is, and maybe I could be stretching it, but it seems like there's a lot of intentionality that's gone into these things. I also really like how the stances are used too, and we'll kind of get into a subsection of Fujimoto's animation, but I love how the hands swishing through the air and having these mini small circles formed by Megumi as he turns the corner as well. It's like he's almost struggling to keep up, or he's struggling to turn the corner as he's like trying to just keep a bit of concentration while doing it with all the dogs and everything that's going on with all the pressure. So it really creates this feeling that things are tense, and there's a sense of urgency that's genuinely created out of the scene and how it's animated, beyond just the very fact within the narrative that there is something that we need to get to, but we need to create the urgency that there's something to get to, and Fujimoto does that very well. This leads us very nicely, as we spoke about stances and stuff, it leads us nicely to this thing on live reference or real life reference. We did get a lot of this in The God of High School, and there was literal motion capture, but this scene doesn't use motion capture, but it does use a good amount of live reference. There is a tweet which I have put in the show notes, or I will put in the show notes, where it's a tweet from Fujimoto themselves. There's a tweet of how they did the very opening of the scene where Megumi's hand touches the wall and then they go up the stairs, and it's actually really funny because I don't know if the person filming it was Fujimoto and that was their colleague or vice versa, but the person who's going to climb up the stairs trips when they're doing the reference shot. It's a very good tweet, but it also shows the layout as well of the very animation or the scene which Megumi's climbing up the stairs. And so it just shows the importance of live reference, and it really shows the importance of tools as well. And there's a lot of discourse on tools, especially with stuff like X-Arm coming out and 3D and how's that going to be used. But I would also push back on this and say that 3D, similarly to reference or rotoscoping or anything, is simply a tool, and it's how we utilize it which is of most importance, when it's used most effectively, as we've seen multiple times in JJK, such as the 3D background for the spinning on the Watanabe cut or live reference on Fujimoto's cut. It can enhance things so much more, and there's just a bit more delicacy I think that comes with Fujimoto's cut as they go up the stairs, and that comes from that attention, or at least that focus on live reference, or creating a bit more of a realistic and urgent run rather than one that is probably what we can describe as maybe completely stylized. We now move on to the bundle of animators that I said, a bundle of stuff, and this is going to be a very quick point. I don't want to spend too much time on this because we got to get to those voice subs. And so we have Shingo Yamashita, who directed the OP, alongside a bunch of other WebGen animators. Yamashita has made amazing connections throughout the past 10 or so years, and to come up front, it is one of my favorite animators ever. And it is for a variety of reasons. It's probably a bit too long to explain right now, but mostly just because of how experimental they are. But recently they've been doing directing. They recently directed Pokemon Twilight Wings, and here they are directing the Jujutsu Kaisen OP, which turned out, in my opinion, to be insanely successful, not only just with its audience, but with me. I really enjoyed it. I listened to it every day, honestly. And I think the reason for that partially is just because when you get a great set of people together, things usually work out. And when you have someone who is who knows their strengths and knows who they are and has been able to see what they're able to do throughout the years, I think it gives you a very good capability to get these people together and really put something really awesome together, because you know who in past times has been able to pull X off, who's been able to pull off Y, and you combine that together and you get a great OP like this. Obviously, there's a lot of other factors as well. I'm exaggerating, I'm gassing up Shingo Yamashita because he's amazing, but there's still a point to be made that directing is so important in coordinating animators together, and Yamashita does exactly that. Just a tiny list of the animators on this OP, even though there are many, but a few include animators like Moaang, Weilin, Zhang, potentially. How they were credited is debatable, but Gogo or Weilin Zhang, Bahi JD, Nakaya, Onsen, and that's just a few. I think there are a host more which I'm just not remembering, but it's an awesome OP and it's very well put together. And then our final one, which I'm also going to try and rocket through because I think it kind of proves our point for us, and that is Yuuki Igarashi. Igarashi is the solo animator for the ending for Jujutsu Kaisen, and this has been a very famous ending in recent times, and I think it's going to stay there as a very famous ending because it's very well put together. and it kind of brings our characters into a very non-serious context, being just block colors and having a good time dancing and just having fun. And I really like that theme and setup, so it's a very good departure from the OP and from the show itself, which is pretty heavy. Not too heavy, but at least, when you're getting into the action, sometimes it's nice to see your characters in a completely different context that is really detached from all of this. And the JJK ED does exactly that by Yuuki Igarashi. From what I understand of it, similarly to the cuts which I spoke about in regards to Fujimoto, there is a good amount of live reference, and I heard that there's some rotoscoping in there as well, and so that is good, but we shouldn't undermine I'm not saying people saying this are undermining the talent of Yuki Igarashi, because they implemented rotoscoping into these very cuts, but it's good to note that Igarashi has a lot of experience in this area anyway. Igarashi previously worked quite a lot on the Welcome to the Ballroom project at Production IG, and that involved a lot of dancing cuts from them, and so they're not the same dancing. However, there is a sort of, I don't want to say set of styles or a specific way of doing things, but being able to exude confidence in your animation is important, and I think that Igarashi does a really good job at doing that, and I'm not surprised based on how much dancing they've done and everything from how certain parts of the body push into the camera, how some muscles are relaxed and all that. These are like very meta knowledge-y sort of things that I'm sure that Igarashi knows as a result of handling dance and performance so regularly. The aesthetic also works very well for smearing, or we can call it smearing, at least these traces which come off the arms or the massive or the big movements, of the characters. So if we take Yuji's hand movements, we get these white traces, and same applies to Gojo as well. As their hands move through, it just makes things easier to see, and it also expands their presence as well on the screen. It's a small point, but I think especially with the Gojo cut, as Gojo enters the door stylishly, what's really cool is how when he throws his hands up and throws his hands down, because we're able to see his traces, it just creates a bigger sense of presence that I am Gojo. And I'm sure a lot of people already love Gojo's presence as is. They already respect him quite a lot. It's kind of like the Levi, I think, at least in how people approach him, the equivalent of that in JJK. But in the case of when he's dancing, it has a very dominant feeling to it because of these smears and stuff. And so I think that's a good place to almost end this analysis. And just to end on a final insight, I think I didn't expect JJK to be this good. Honestly, I'm not gonna try and hide it, but I didn't expect this level of analysis for JJK, at least from my part. And I'm not surprised now based on who is working on it and the potential which they have. It isn't the perfect anime, and I'd be lying if I said that was the case. From the technical perspective, I do struggle with its compositing in areas, not every episode, but at least with some of them. I can agree, it does feel very intrusive, but I don't think that is a deal breaker for me, and it's something that is going to completely hinder my enjoyment with the animation of Jujutsu Kaisen. I still think this is something to celebrate, and on the part of none other than Sunghoo Park, I can only say thank you for allowing these to happen, or allowing things to get this far and this good. And hopefully we'll be able to celebrate further on into the future as these staff members really make things happen. And so that is the analysis for this week. Hopefully you did enjoy this one. A bit different to the Fire Force one, but I really tried to just cover some of the main bases. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. I do recommend, obviously, Sakaburo for Jujutsu Kaisen. You can check out most of the cuts from there that I do refer to. And also I'm sure there are loads of other resources out there as well. Keep watching the show as well, and hopefully you'll be able to recognize some of the animators too, because that is also a very important thing as well. But now let's try something new. Here is the voice subs segment for this week. I would usually say on the In the Moment segment, if you are new, then here is how it goes. But we are all new to this, and this is an experimental segment for this week. If it doesn't work out, then this might be discontinued, but I'm just trying something out this week, and I want to make the show a bit more interactive. And so in this episode, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be taking voice submissions. We have 3 voice submissions. Actually, I'm going to go through all of them and reply to them, and then we can wrap up with closing thoughts and end the episode for this week. And so I have the voice subs on my USB, but I decided to keep them until I actually do the episode so I have a genuine reaction. So I'm a bit nervous right now, but I'm sure they're all fine and it will be very fun. The way this is going to work is that you can submit your voice on SpeakPipe. I have a SpeakPipe link, which I put in the description for the episode. And I also put it out on Twitter for this sort of trial run this week. And I also put out a question for the week, which was, what is an anime that you really like, but you don't really talk about? So there'll usually be a question for the week, assuming we continue to do this. And I also just opened it up to general questions as well. So if you just have any question that's anime and manga related for me, then you can leave it via voice as well, or you can answer the question of the week and I'll sort of respond and we can have a bit of a discussion based on it. Our first voice submission comes from Lethargilistic, and I will insert that in now.
This is Lethargilistic. An anime I like but hardly talk about is Punchline, and the reason I don't talk about it much isn't that I don't recommend it frequently, because I do. But it is so imperative to go into it without spoilers, and I beg you to take that seriously, even if you, like me, don't care about spoiler culture. If you're into anime enough that you're listening to Jamal's show, you need to watch Punchline. Do not drop it early. So now, to break my rule a bit and delve into it slightly, why do I say don't drop it early? It's not because the first episodes are bad. It's because Punchline is an exercise in information control and steady stakes raising. So a lot of what's in the first episodes doesn't make sense or otherwise seems like a joke that doesn't land. I guarantee that it is not just a joke. It is the setup for one of the most satisfying anime plot lines I have ever encountered. Completely, utterly ridiculous, and wholeheartedly humanist. But more than that, some people get turned off by the first episode because it has a weird panty shot joke that pays off more significantly like 8 episodes later. In fact, the name of the show is Panty Line in Japanese, and it's a joke that the OP makes fun of. So this often prompts people to write it off as like an ecchi show they wouldn't be into before it's even revealed that, unironically, the fate of humanity rests in panties. But the many-layered meaning of the Panty Line name is a metaphor for the many-layered meaning of the show. And right now, it's sitting at a flat 7 on Mal, and it is the most criminally underrated anime I have ever seen. Trust me, watch Punchline. Do not drop it early.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing so much because that submission was like the best thing that I've experienced in such a long time, and that passion in your voice, the Lethargilistic, was amazing. So thank you for the submission. And I personally haven't watched Punchline, but now I'm like almost dead set to watch it. And I'm sure that there are people in the audience right now, or someone who's listening who's like, I don't know, in the car or walking to class or something, that is now like so convinced to watch this anime. For the first voice submission, that was honestly the most like my expectations have just been blown completely. So I really want to watch Punchline now. The fact that you said that there's a layer to the show that reveals the multi-layered nature of the show is just I have to see this now, and I'm literally checking in on my anime list right now while I'm doing this show, and yeah, I need to watch it. I need to check whether it's on my list actually. For a matter of fact, I actually do have it on my planning to watch list, but I'll be honest and say that I do that with a lot of anime where I add it to my plan to watch, but I don't actually watch. So that will be done, I hope, very soon. It came out in 2015, which is actually quite good, done by Mappa, so no, I'm not really judging it. It's kind of a joke. It's just because today's context and Mappa. But now I'm very excited to watch this anime, and I'm kind of lost for words right now just based on that submission alone. Thank you very much for leaving that sub. I have to watch Punchline now, and I will hopefully deliberate in another segment in the future. Hopefully we actually do these voice segments more often. And yeah, thank you very much for that. Watch Punchline, everyone. You heard him. Our second voice submission comes from Ian at the Research Anime Group, and I will now play that in here.
Hey, this is Ian from the Anime Research Group, and the anime that I love but rarely talk about is Read or Die. I think I discovered it indirectly through Ken Akamatsu's Negima. In the end notes, he would mention that some of the character designs for like the Library Girls were based on the Read or Die designs. I don't really see it, but that's what got me to find it and watch it in the first place. There's an OVA and a TV series. I really think that people should watch the OVA, although the TV series is also good. And the basic setup is that the British Library has agents with paper powers who go around collecting rare books. And in the OVA, this also leads to them fighting against Aijin, or clones of historical figures like Beethoven, Jean-Henri Fabre on a mechanical grasshopper, Mata Hari, etc. And it's just kind of a fun action flick with some decent music. Hideyuki Kurita has done some writing work on other anime that I really enjoy, in particular Samurai Flamenco. The TV series follows a bunch of different characters, and then the British Library follows more of an antagonistic role, as does this Chinese organization Dokusensha. But they're both real worth your time, and watch the OVA. Cheers.
Thank you, Ian, for your voice submission, and that I think as a British person as well, the British Library bit really got me. Like, I'm gonna like end up telling a story here, but that was literally when I was like very early into primary school. I literally made maybe not the British Library setup, but there was a story that I made that kind of concerned historical figures coming to life as a result of like drawing them, and then they had like a whole fight. It was a very bad story, but it instantly reminded me of that. And I think I've heard of Read or Die before, but I just never really thought about watching it. But now I added it to my list now, the OVA at least. And also it's really funny how you mentioned the thing of the British Library. It's really cool how I think there's been a lot of not legitimate hate, but at least a lot of slight grudges towards how a lot of anime take place in Japan, and people are like, oh yeah, the world is just centered around Japan in anime, which is like kind of what you expect. But also that makes it a lot more convincing as well, considering a lot of that discourse is centered around that. So seeing something British Library as well, now as a Brit, I'm just going to like literally compare everything that happened everything that our country, or at least what England looks like relative to the British Library, just to be that guy. Yeah, I feel like now I have so much more anime to watch because of these submissions, and I have to just say, these are so like, I didn't expect in my wildest dreams for these to be so like, I don't say because I make it sound like it's some sort of like, it needs to be like good. What makes a good voice submission? Nothing. But I'm just so blown away at how this segment is working out so well. So thank you so much for sending that in. As Ian said, watch Read or Die to everyone in the audience. And yes, on to our next and final submission. That is from one of the members of the Buildcasters podcast, and also runs Black Anime Podcast, which I highly recommend following online. They have a website. I should get that in the show notes. And I'll also get all the podcasts for those who have left their submissions as well into the show notes as well. So you can check those out too. But on to the submission.
What's up? This is Ash, head honcho of Black Anime Podcasts and co-host of Buildcasters. And I'm here to talk to you about an anime that I really like, but hardly ever mention, and that anime is called Gun Sword, originally airing in 2005 and animated by AIC Asta and directed by Goro the Goat Taniguchi. Gun Sword is a mecha anime about a mysterious character called Van, who wanders the planet of endless illusion in search of the claw-handed man that murdered his fiancée in cold blood. I'm sure, as you know, he can summon a massive mecha from orbit called Dan of the Thursday, and much battles, giant shooty robots, and avenging ensues. So yeah, check out Gun Sword. It is definitely an underrated mecha gem. Peace out. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Ash, for the voice sub. I found that one really all three of these, but like this one in particular, I found these all very funny, and I think it's just because these plots are so bizarre. Like the fact that all three of you decided to put like the most bizarre plot lines on this segment, it just blows my mind. And I don't know, anime's always just been a bit, I don't say weird, because that kind of gives into what some people think anime is, and they kind of want us to call it weird, which I wouldn't say it explicitly is, but to be completely honest, sometimes it can be bloody weird. And in the case of Gun Sword, the names and everything are just out of this world. Like, I wouldn't expect a whole, I think there's also a lot of value in when someone describes a plot to you rather than when you read it or on paper or on your phone. And having that explained, I was just like, what? Like, all the drama from having your fiance murdered in cold blood to then summoning a giant mecha and everything, it's just like, how do these relate? And the fact that it's 26 episodes as well, that I feel like that sounds like something that would be made more today. I don't want to say anime, this is a very like bad generalization, but and I don't want to say that I think anime has gotten weirder today, but I feel like a lot of stories are a lot more risk-taking, kind of. I do like to think of the productions today as very safe to a degree, but at the same time, there are some anime that I don't think would ever be made like this decade at all, and Gun Sword feels like something that would be made like 2018, and yeah, that sounded really good. I'm also adding this to my list. I'm adding all three anime to my list now because this has just turned into like a massive culture shock to me that there's so much anime I haven't watched. But thank you, Ash, for your submission, a sub, and thank you, everyone. Yes, thank you, Lethargilistic. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Ash, for the voice subs for this week. If you listening want to have your voice on the podcast like this, because I think this was actually very fun. I haven't had this fun in a long time. If you do want to get your voice on the podcast, then check the SpeakPipe link in the description of this podcast. You can also just leave a question, but as always, it's been a great time doing this side segment, and let's get to the Jujutsu Kaisen stuff, and I'll just end with some closing thoughts for the episode. I'll be honest and say that because I'm just so blown away by the segment, I'm even forgetting all the Jujutsu Kaisen stuff in my head. But yeah, okay, Jujutsu Kaisen, good anime, well animated. It has a very interesting way of going about things in terms of how its director does a decent amount of directing, as well as animating too. And we also have multiple animators that really know what they're doing and also just have a lot of things down. So whether that's Fujimoto's intentionality in smears, whether that is Keiichiro Watanabe's, again, intentionality with smears, and the setups which come with the use of 3D tools or live reference, everything seems to have come together quite well for JJK and its animators. I can't say that it is the perfect mix of everything, particularly when we consider compositing in something that I think is a weak point of the anime. Unfortunately, I don't think that it lends itself to more aesthetically pleasing animations to watch. But with that being said, there will always be something holding an animation back subjectively, and with compositing, the sad thing is that, or not even the sad thing, the good thing kind of, is that You can't have, and this applies to art in general, but I think it makes its case a lot with compositing, that you can't just have an objectively bad composite. Everyone will view it differently. Some people don't care. Some people think it looks great, and that is fine, and that is only kind of addition to your experience. For me, it holds it back, unfortunately, but that being said, it isn't a deal breaker, and Jujutsu Kaisen is still doing insanely well in the animation department, and I really hope its animators really pull through, because they have a really good thing going at the moment. Thank you for listening to another episode of Guess in the Mecha. That has been episode 71. I've had so much fun today, and it really is down to those voice subs. Thank you very much everyone who left a voice sub. Again, your ats and stuff will be in the description for this episode. If not, it will be in the show notes, most definitely on my blog. Be sure to check those out. And yes, I've had so much fun. I don't really know what to say. I'm kind of stalling at this point. If you are on YouTube, feel free to like and subscribe, and also, yes, the bell. Comment if you enjoy it as well. Comment on what you thought about the segment. That's a very important thing. What did you think about the segment this week? Because I am trying something new, and I think that it could work out, but your feedback is obviously very appreciated. If you are also on Apple Podcasts, it would be very appreciated if you left a review as well. And yeah, helps with all those algorithmy things. Have a great day, have a great week. Watch Gun Sword, watch Read or Die, and watch Punchline, as I will be doing soon. And yes, I have been your host Jamal today, and this has been Guess in the Mecha. The music in this production goes as follows: 8-bit title screen by Joth, Mandatory Overtime by Joth, and Difference by Chasers Gaming.